Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at key concept 4.2.2, continuing with the market revolution. Now before we've talked about what the market revolution was, how it played out, what all the components were, now we have to look at what the effects of it were. Predominantly this presentation is looking at the social effects. So economic changes, how did that change society because the essentials of the American economy had changed. Here we go. Alright, first thing we need to look at is what is changing within sort of labor systems. So this affected how men and women were involved in the economy and how they participated. So let's look at what's going on. Now, one thing to know is the market revolution is happening within the same era as the transition from Jeffersonian democracy to Jacksonian democracy. Remember, Jefferson had this grand idea of how the future of the U.S. economy was going to be small farmers, right? Sort of this yeoman republic. Well, that's gone because of the market revolution. It changes what people tended to do to make money. We are now in Jacksonian democracy. And Jacksonian democracy wasn't just about agrarianism. It also was more about political participation and greater involvement of the common man. And that didn't just have to deal with agriculture. So as the market revolution develops, we see that factory work is now more predominant for creating manufactured goods than the cottage industry. The cottage industry is also called the putting out system. It's where people would hand make sort of, full products, like one complete item at their home, right? So if you raised, let's say, sheep, for instance, you would be in charge of raising the livestock, shearing them, taking the wool, spinning it into yarn, and then using that yarn and the cotton, no, we're using wool here, sorry, to make things out of that wool. So from the very beginning of raw resource to finished product. Factory work has changed that. We're now those farms and plantations and whatnot, they are just making the raw resources. They send them to factories to process into manufactured goods. Now, because of the market revolution, we see a growth in urban and rural populations. Urban populations grow because of immigration. People come here to participate with these new available jobs. People are also moving more into urban areas to take advantage of these higher paying factory jobs than what they could be making while farming. Meanwhile, rural populations grow because our population is undergoing natural growth, and there's westward expansion into Indian territory for the most part, but we see mass growth there as people move westward. All right, so what we see is, especially in the South, agriculture is based on cash crops. Those who had small farming enterprises that involved the cottage industry, they're not as predominant anymore. We see that the goal is now one part of the economy grows the raw materials, the other part works to process it into a good, and then you have the manufactured finished product to be sold to the consumer. We talked about the steam engine before, I think in the last presentation or so, and what this did is it made it so factories could exist in cities and urban centers and not just along waterways. So that leads and kind of exacerbates the factory system because they could be anywhere. They didn't have to rely on a water source to power their machines. Okay, so greater demand for manufactured goods meant it paid more to work in a factory. So supply and demand work so that basically resources move in an economy towards what the populace wants. The populace wanted these manufactured goods, so that meant that there were more jobs in that industry and they paid better. Farming starts to disappear as a way of life, increasingly replaced by factory jobs. Realize that as people move into cities, there is no urban infrastructure, especially for sanitation. So cities were especially disgusting in this era. There were no sewers. We're talking about sewers for runoff water and for, the nice term is night soil. You can use your imagination there. But what's going on is there was no federal money used to create cities into safe places and clean places to live. We're going to talk about that in the late 1800s with the progressive movement, but realize cities from now all the way to then are kind of these cesspools and just I couldn't imagine the smell, and I don't want to. Okay, one change in kind of gender relations as it relates to the market revolution was that women were increasingly working in factory jobs. And sort of the system, the sort of proper noun term you want to use for that, because it's the best way to describe it, best example, is the Lowell-Waltham system. It's also just, I learned it as just the Lowell system. You do what you want there. But the idea was that if a family had unmarried daughters, instead of just contributing to the home, they might not have the putting out or cottage industry anymore. They would send their daughters to factories to live there and to work there. Okay? Their money would be sent back home. Now, in this system, there were strict rules on social activities. So they lived in dormitories on the same sort of campus or site as the factory. They would work pretty much all day, and they only had some independence to go out on weekends on predetermined outings where only women were allowed to participate. So we see women can have more jobs, but the question here is this really greater independence? And, it's a mixed bag. It's questionable. Now, unmarried women are basically going from being controlled by their father to being controlled by their boss, and if they get married, they will then be controlled by their husband. So, maybe on the surface, it says, okay, women can have more economic capabilities, but they're still tied to some man. This patriarchal system is still controlling and ruling over them, so it's not a huge change in gender relations or gender norms. Okay, so let's see how the market revolution is affecting the creation of more sort of strata when we talk about classes in society. So, as industrialization happens, so is the creation of class and class conflict. So, manufacturing created larger houses, better clothing, cheaper, so I should say less expensive products, and this helps differentiate classes. So, materialism and consumerism, so materialism is valuing what you own, consumerism is focusing on buying things, are tied to the bourgeoisie, the middle class. And because there's different goods that have different prices, this helps sort of create this visual and sort of physical representation of what class you are a member of. The upper class, the middle class, or the laboring poor. Let's look at each of these. Now, the business elite, this is the high upper class. Things that they got to enjoy due to their wealth included carriages and servants. So that meant that if they lived in the cities, they wouldn't have to walk through the muck of the streets. They could travel in a carriage by horse from place to place. There's some changes in how people dressed with a bit more complicated outfits, and you can see that to the upper right there. Because America has a textile industry now, and because there is a growing middle class and the business elite, it means there's greater demand for more luxurious fabrics and outfits. Right? Now, what resources did the business elite provide? Capital, so the money to invest in all this manufacturing and industrialization. They would have had the money to provide the land to build the factories and the entrepreneurship. So kind of that risk-taking, hoping to make money off of their ventures. So realize the business elite is kind of that upper 1 to 5% of the population. They were not common, but they had a lot of power. Now, the middle class. Middle class could represent farmers, merchants, lawyers, doctors, all these people that weren't so much ruling the market revolution in businesses, but working with products that are made for them to use and that in a way provide services, kind of, I put it here, service-based labor to the populace as a whole. In the Northeast, this was about 30%. In the South, there was not much of a middle class. We're going to talk about that later. Okay. So a term here that goes along with middle class service-related jobs are white-collar jobs. It's the idea of they could wear white-collared shirts because they weren't going to get as dirty in their work as, say, urban workers were in factories. Okay, having that nice, clean white shirt represented that you're sort of dealing with paperwork and with service rather than manual labor. Okay, the people that represented the bulk of the population, especially in cities, are the laboring poor or urban workers. Now, anytime there was an economic downturn, these were called panics back then. Major ones were the panics of 1819 and 1837. They were the hardest ones hit because they were already at the bottom. They had the least to lose, but they were the first to be sort of pushed away when hard times came. So if a company, was, on hard times and facing bankruptcy, all the urban workers that were, had no skills were the first to be fired. Another thing going on with urban workers was child labor. So with the laboring poor, education was not valued because they were barely making enough money to get by. Education will be valued by the middle class and the business elite because they have the money to do it, and education is going to work in the enterprises that they're involved in. The resource provided by urban workers was manual labor. That's called blue-collar work. So typically, think of like heavy overalls, thick material that's going to protect their skin and their bodies in the case of some sort of industrial accident. Right. Now, with the urban workers came early attempts at unionization. Most states said they were illegal, so they were unsuccessful. Eventually, there is a Supreme Court case called Commonwealth versus Hunt that says labor unions and strikes are legal to happen, but workers still didn't have protections from being fired for trying to unionize. So it was kind of like saying, sure, you can try to form a union, but if the company chooses to fire all of you because you did that, that's not our problem. So unions are going to be more of a big deal when we get after the Civil War into kind of this, how do I say this? Sort of this era of big business and mass industrialization. We're doing like light industrialization here. So as industrialization is larger, so are the attempts at unionization. All right, our last slide here is thinking about how gender and family roles changed because of the market revolution. So let's see what's going on. First, we kind of need to review a couple terms we've seen before. One is Republican motherhood. We looked at this back kind of in that early Republic era. The idea that it was mothers' jobs to educate their children, especially their sons, to be good citizens. Another element was Republican marriage or sentimental marriage. The idea of marrying for love instead of having an arranged marriage. And all this sort of lent to this idea of a cult of domesticity, that women should be in the private sphere only. They should not be out in the public dealing with sort of men's jobs. So dealing with money, dealing with leadership, dealing with kind of all the problems of the world. Women were expected to stay at home, and the patriarchy at the time claimed that it was trying to protect women in the process. So this is where we were before, and it's continuing during the market revolution. Women are still expected to be in the private sphere. They are involved a little bit in the public sphere with those voluntary organizations, but we saw before it's not a huge step forward because they were still expected to run the house as well. Now, one thing that's changing with family roles had to do with education. I mentioned it a little bit before in the previous slide, but what we see in the North and the Midwest is children start getting a public elementary education. That means that the state government is providing a free education for children. Okay? A big advocate for this, his name was Horace Mann. In my mind, I always think like horseman. Okay, sounds kind of stupid, but it helps me to remember it. He was a reformer who said that education is so important that it should be funded by the government, and teachers should be professionally trained individuals instead of just, women teaching their kids at home, or people who said, oh, I got to go teach them how to read, write, and do some basic math, but not have any sort of professional training, any schooling themselves in how to teach. He was a big advocate, especially in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts ends up being the first state to offer a free public education in this way. Now, this is what I mentioned before. Education was valued by the middle class and the business elite, but the working class couldn't value it because their children were in this kind of economic necessity to provide for the family. The parents are working, can't even scrape by a living to provide for their kids, so they send their kids to work as well, who would then be paid basically nothing to do it and given the worst jobs. Okay? Oftentimes factories employed children to get and crawl inside the machines to unjam them because they had tiny fingers. Okay? So fingers, lose a finger, lose your job. Okay? It was not a good situation, and they had no protections legally if that should happen. So there were no child labor laws at the time. Okay, kind of a way to sum this up is that there were some steps forward for women in this time period, but they're marginal. When you look at the economic issue of the Lowell system, Sure, they could get industrial jobs, but they were still in a way subservient to a male figure. They might have some social steps forward, like those voluntary organizations working to promote good acts through their church and through like charity organizations. But that didn't get them any legal protections of equality. It didn't get them the right to vote. It didn't get them anything that would help them to advance their causes and give them a voice in society. So if we're talking about the idea of did sort of women get any democratic abilities in this era? Socially, maybe. Legally, politically, absolutely not. The changes were a reforming of the self, not the system. No one was questioning the system except the women's rights movement that we've talked a little bit about before. Alright, thank you for watching as always. You know what your next steps are, so please keep up on your work and don't fall behind. So, this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in class. Bye.